Hello and welcome to Weird Together, where we celebrate the latest and greatest in independent horror films. I'm Brendan Storr, host of the Ghost Story Guys podcast.
I'm Joseph Camo, host of The Cardinal Rule.
We're not critics.
We're not experts.
We're just weird together. Joseph, my friend, how you doing?
I am good. The semester's wrapping up. I am getting ready to go on the summer break, teach a few online classes. But, one of the joys of teaching is, these long breaks. And I am looking forward to not doing much for the next week or two before I actually try to undertake a few projects. So overall doing well. How are you, Bren?
I'm good. My time, as I mentioned last episode, my time in Montreal is winding down. I have been forcibly relocated 4 floors up from my previous room. So if I seem a little quieter on this episode, it's because we're recording it at 10 o'clock at night, and my new roommates keep much more normal hours than my previous roommates. My previous roommates, I was, as I was saying to Joseph off air, I'd get up at 4 a.m. to use a can, and at least one of them would still be awake. I remember one time getting up at 5 and he was still awake, whereas these guys have 9 to 5 jobs. So, I'm not going to be able to play the tuba for you the way I'd hoped. But other than that, we should be fine.
So now, as we were talking about this before, you're the weird one now, right?
I mean, I always have been, but it's become really clear since coming up here. I realized that they weren't quite sure what to make of me when I walked out of the bathroom just in a towel. And I realized, we had reached that point with my old roommates, everyone just kind of making eggs in your underwear is not a big deal. And I noticed here everyone cooks fully clothed. And so I'm thinking, all right, fine, I got to adjust some things. But we are not here to talk about me cooking eggs in my underpants, although that would be a great show.
So says you.
Someone has to, Joseph. Let me have this. I need this. But yes, we're not here to talk about such things. We are here instead to talk about this week's film, and it is a film, Joseph, that is the antithesis of that garbage movie we didn't do a couple episodes back. That movie is Enys Men. Enys Men tells a story of the volunteer, volunteer, on a remote island off the coast of Cornwall. And Joseph, I don't even know how to describe this. Really, basically just her entire perception of time starts to fall apart. What's real? What's not? Who freaking knows? That is the story of Enys Men. And Joseph, that makes it sound not great, and I actually quite like this movie, but I was really kind of struggling because it's hard to describe what happens in the film. This podcast could almost be called Bren Makes Joseph Watch Experimental Horror Movies.
That's true. And just kind of see how I react to it. Though, as we'll talk about, I rather liked this film as well, and I would describe it as a descent into madness. Seems to be kind of what this is about, but there's a lot more to it than that.
I really think so too. But before we talk about the film, of course, you never go into a movie completely blind. You take every movie you've ever seen in there with you. And so before we talk about Enys Men, we're going to take apart the baggage. All right, Joseph, what, if any, baggage did you have going into Enys Men?
So I had no familiarity with this filmmaker. That's a recurring theme here. A lot of these are new films for me and new filmmakers. But I have been made to watch by my good friend Bren a handful of films that were either shot in 16 millimeter or that tried to emulate the look of 16 millimeter. Scare of 61st, A Wounded Fawn, Skinamarink. So I couldn't help but compare this film to those, right? And there I did have some comparisons, at least to a couple of those, or at least things that I thought this did that were kind of interesting, comparable to those, or maybe even better than some of those. So that was really the main baggage, is comparing this to other 16 millimeter shot films.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know going in that it was shot in 16. That was not part of my baggage. For me, my baggage going in, I didn't know much about it. I was actually similar to you, but since I've been in Montreal, I've been watching a lot of movies at this place called Cinema du Parc. And it's sort of, there's a really great movie scene here. I got to be honest. That's one of the things I'm going to miss when I go back to Victoria. And one of the things they do at Park is just they have all these great independent films. Like Day After Tomorrow, in the afternoon, I'm going to see this I think it's a Serbian film, not a Serbian film, which is incredibly fucked up.
As a genre?
But it's, no, there's a film called a Serbian film.
Oh, that's what it's called. Okay.
That is supremely fucked.
Okay.
Look it up on Wikipedia. I've never seen it. I never will. The film they're playing is called, I think it's Phi 1.618. And it's this, again, crazy, it might be Serbian, might be Czech, I can't remember, but it's this kind of wacky sci-fi film. And they just have stuff like that. And so I've been going to Park, going to their after midnight screenings, and they kept playing a trailer for Enys Men. It looked really spooky. I thought, I'm getting kind of The Witch vibes from this. Have you seen The Witch?
I have. Loved it.
Yeah, so I was getting kind of The Witch vibe. So I thought, all right, so it's going to be slow. It's going to be kind of moody. But I thought, I got to see it. And so I actually, the first time I got to see this was was on the big screen at Cinema de Park maybe about a month ago. And I didn't like it. I recognized that there were people who would cream their jeans for it. But I think I went in, and actually this is something I wanted to talk about just in brief, is I think we forget that our headspace to a large extent determines our experience with a film.
Right.
So that day I kind of went in expecting, okay, it's going to be a kind of a folksy horror, like a folk horror, but it's going to be a linear narrative. What I got, my brain went, no. I wanted A, B's, I wanted plot, not vibes. And, what is this old-timey skinnamarink bullshit?
Right. It's interesting because, like, I just, my experience juxtaposed against that is I'm used to watching films Bren recommends. And this, within that context, was quite good because my expectations were more from coming, and all jokes aside, though, I'm coming from an expectation of we're going to be watching obscure films, experimental films that are, in a different sort of a niche, and that'll be new experiences for me. Whereas you maybe had something a little more, kind of mainstream expectation or comparable to the folk horror. So you're spot on though about how those expectations absolutely shape our experiences with these.
Yeah, like when we watched, when we did Reaptown, one of the reasons we did Reaptown and not Horror in the High Desert 2 Minerva was because when I watched Horror in the High Desert 2 the first time, I had to rent it via VPN through an American website, and the VPN just fucked everything up. So the audio was out of sync. It was a pain in the ass to set up, and so I didn't enjoy the film. I was super pissed that I thought, because I liked Horror in the High Desert, so I thought, part 2 is going to be good. But then it turns out, no, this is dog shit.
The experience wasn't good. The film might have been, but the experience wasn't.
That's it. So I actually bought it because I like Dutch Marriage as a filmmaker. And so I bought it and I watched it again when I was more together and when I didn't have all that baggage going in. And I enjoyed it so much more. And that was very much the case with Enys Men. When I kind of went in the second time, watched it here in my apartment, had done some research on what the filmmaker Mark Jenkin was trying to say, I enjoyed it so much more. And so sometimes I think it's important for people to recognize, maybe the movie doesn't suck. Maybe you just were not in a place to watch it.
So I would say that does not apply to Demonic. It still sucks.
That's it. Show's over. I will die on this hill, Joseph. I love that movie. I'm going to watch it again tonight just to spite you.
Oh, you do that.
But one last thing I want to touch on, and before we actually talk about the movie itself, just because this kind of pops out at me as a real, kind of an interesting point. Have you ever found when you watch a movie with someone and they're not enjoying it, that it affects your ability to enjoy it? Do you have that?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. My wife and I have different tastes in films, and there have been points where we've watched films together and I really was enjoying the film and I could tell she was checking out. And then I started to kind of the gravity of that started pulling me out of the film, out of enjoying the film, because I could tell she was disengaging from it and delving a little into psychology. I think there's part of us that wants other people to like the things we want, or wants other people to like the things we like, because that's an affirmation of our values, and being pro-social animals, we don't want to be excluded from the tribe, so to speak. So when someone else doesn't like something that you like, then there's this kind of fear of is something wrong with my tastes or my sensibilities? And Yeah, I've absolutely experienced that. Yeah.
Again, so much goes into how we consume art that I just don't think we always consider that when we evaluate something. And again, this is why I was happy to be given a second chance to evaluate Enys Men, because I fucking loved it the second time around, and we're going to talk about that in the Octagon. Welcome to the Octagon. 2 men enter, 2 men leave. All right, Joseph, what did you think of Enys Men?
I thought it was a very well crafted film. This filmmaker is artistically gifted. There were so many things that were well done. Overall, there were just so many things about it that were outstanding. The visuals, the color, the setting, the shots, the lighting, the imagery, that was all outstanding. The subtlety of how the narrative was delivered was masterful, in my opinion. They didn't have any kind of major exposition. There was so much of showing with very little telling. Sometimes the radio would maybe tell little bits, but they let that unfold in such a great way. There was a clear artistic vision for the film overall. They established a sense of isolation for this character. There's so many other things that we can get into. That I love the retro feel of it, the old generator, the old radio, the old shortwave radio. If there's a critique, there was a point where it felt like it was dragging on a little bit. There was a point where it felt like I was noticing, I'm looking at my watch, there's 45 minutes left. But still, everything that was done with excellence, in my opinion. Yeah, no,
I couldn't agree more. Again, the film was directed by British director Mark Jenkin, and this is his second feature. His first was a black and white film called Bait, which I think came out, I want to say in 2019 or 2020. And Enys Men is his second. He made a number of short films prior to this, but this was only his second narrative, and this was actually his first narrative film in color.
Okay.
Because prior to this, he'd done everything in straight up black and white. And he felt that for this one, in order to properly give the period setting and to really kind of use the full visual language that he had envisioned, it needed to be color. And you're right. I mean, the way it's shot, he uses a 16 millimeter Bolex camera. And he said that he wanted to make it look like a lost film from the 70s.
Okay. It absolutely looks like that too.
Oh, it really does. It looks and feels like that. I don't think there's anything that feels period inauthentic to me. And he was very much inspired by, I don't know, have you ever seen any of the public service films from Britain from the 70s, the ones that like warn kids off of flying kites near power lines, things like this?
I have not. No.
Okay, that's actually worth looking up on YouTube. I've only seen one or two. Paul, my co-host over on Ghost Story Guys, for those who don't know, he showed me, and they're genuinely creepy.
Interesting.
These really talented directors were given public broadcasting money to make these PSAs, basically. And there was one Paul sent me, I think it was about playing in water, and it's genuinely spooky. Jenkin was inspired by stuff like this and stuff like, what was the film? Stone Tape?
I have seen that, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah. So he was inspired by things like that.
Yeah, I totally see that. I mean, it has a lot of the same sort of feel to it, absolutely.
Interesting. See, I've never seen Stone Tape.
I watched that a while back because I did a video about the Stone Tape theory, which, with my interest in paranormal and kind of the science or pseudoscience side of it, this is one of those explanations for place memory and things like that. So
right.
I watched the film as kind of research for a video I did on that. It's fascinating how that actually has led to kind of become part of the lexicon of when people talk about place memory or stone tape theory, this idea that maybe apparitions or some of them are sort of a recorded residual of some sort of traumatic experience in a place. That film Stone Tape is where that term stone tape theory comes from.
It is, yeah. And really I guess that kind of applies here because the film essentially concerns a haunted island.
Right.
Because it tells a story, as we said in the intro, of a woman who's never named, but she's referred to in the credits as the volunteer, and she works clearly alone on this island, Enys Men, which means Stone Island in Cornish. And this is one of the things I want to talk about is one of the things I got the second time around, because I did a lot of the research for the show by that point, is I didn't understand that Cornish was not only a language, but the Cornish people who live in the south of England, they are a distinct ethnic minority. I didn't know that. They're a Celtic people whose origins date back to the Britons who lived in England in the Middle Ages. So it's an entire language, it's an entire culture. In fact, there were posters printed in English and Cornish. And this is, I believe, the first time a film poster has ever been printed in Cornish.
Interesting.
And Jenkin really made a point of making the ghosts of the film all relevant to the history of Cornwall.
Okay.
You know, Cornwall, like a lot of parts of England, Cornwall was very heavily centered around mining. So there are a number of mining ghosts in the film. They're presented almost as men, but they are in fact dead. They're gone. And he wanted to make the film for these people who were huge parts of making England what it became, but are often forgotten. So miners, the people on the Gavennick, the boat which sank, you know, the fishermen who make their living from the sea and who, again, all of whom help power the great engine of commerce, but who are considered expendable. And knowing a bit more about Cornwall going into it, I was really able to appreciate it that much more. Because it's one thing to, you know, oh, that's spooky, but when you understand that Cornwall has a May Day celebration, so that's why things started happening as she got to the beginning of May.
This is one of the great things about folk horror like this, if it's done well and with authenticity, is those subtexts that if you dig deeper, you find. Saloon, we talked about that a bit, with that being sort of a regional folk horror. And you've done some of the research on this, and it's just fascinating to hear how, as you dig deeper, you find there are layers that are just under the surface that, unless you go exploring those or you're already familiar with that, you might not think of it, right? But how, I think there's so many people who just, when they're trying to create something with a certain artistic aesthetic, they just look for something that feels a certain way, and that, and they're like, oh, hey, the seven maidens in their outfits are going to feel creepy, and miners in a, down in a mine shaft are going to feel creepy, and they just throw them in there. But the best artists have an intentionality and an authentic connection to the actual, the lore and history of these places and spaces in their art. And so I think that just speaks to, how talented this filmmaker is.
Absolutely. And that's something that frustrates me when people say, oh, horror movies, horror doesn't need politics, horror is just a guy slashing a bunch of people, whatever. And that's such a surface reading of horror, because horror has always been a reflection of the anxieties generated in the age from which it comes. I mean, I read this book a while back, and it was boring as fuck, but the thesis was interesting. And one of the things it talked about was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I mean, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a legitimate masterpiece. That is a fantastic movie. Have you ever seen it?
I actually have not. I was familiar with it, but
I would watch it. It is shockingly non-bloody.
Okay.
The actual really bloody films were the sequels. I mean, there is violence, but it's not bloody, and it's exceptional. But what's fascinating about it is the subtext of the film is, in the South, the people have turned on their own. Things have gotten so bad economically in the 70s that they're preying on each other. The fact that it's a family, it's the I can't remember the name of the family, but these folks stumble on this house full of psychotics, but it's like a perversion of the family unit, because it's about how basically the crushing poverty has caused the dissolution of these traditional things. But most people just look at it and go, well, it's I like it because of the chainsaws. I shouldn't say most, but these kind of people who say, well, horror is just what's on the screen. Don't try and bring politics into it. This shit is just inherently political. It just is. And you and I have seen, not to keep banging this drum, but we've seen movies that are made without any kind of subtext, and they bring this show to a crashing halt.
Yes. Yes. There has to be some sort of depth there for the art to be worthwhile. And when you actually have had the experience of seeing something that is egregiously devoid of that, it becomes much more stark how important those subtexts are.
Another thing that I've seen in films that I really find frustrating, this is more of a modern phenomenon, definitely, but it's folks who don't know how to make subtext. Everything is just text.
Right.
You know, I call them, and it's not a very original name, but that's fine because they're not original films. I call it the real Babadook is the friends we made along the way. Because there was the Babadook, which is an exceptional horror film. And in a lot of ways, Babadook is a metaphor for grief, because this family is dealing with the loss of, mother and son are dealing with the loss of the father, and it's tearing them apart. But again, you can enjoy it just as a horror movie. But if you look at it a little bit deeper, oh yeah, no, this is about grief. Whereas I've seen a handful of new films, and I'm not going to say which because I don't want to be shitty, but they're text. The film may as well be called Trauma, because that's just, and you just know, at some point, okay, so he's gonna stab the monster, and then the monster's gonna turn out to be his mom or his friend or whatever, and then the real monster was inside us all along. Jesus Christ, is it over yet? And that's what I appreciated about Enys Men, is that Jenkin he's just on his surface made a film about a woman who's, as you say, descending into madness. But you look under the surface, it's an exploration of Cornish history. It's a nod to the people who made the country what it is, and to a culture which has, for a long time, been forgotten and kind of ground under heel. But it works on so many levels that you can kind of enjoy it wherever you come to it.
You talk about all the filmmakers who try to follow, right, and do what the Babadook did well, but fail to do that, with any sort of skill, that's comparable. And I think that's kind of the what sets apart the really cutting edge artists and the best artists, is they do something that's original. It generally has more depth than you realize. As you dig deeper, you start to find that depth, and then the copycats all follow, and they're all trying to do that. And listen, I don't want to sound, like I'm talking, down my nose at these people. These people are better filmmakers than I am, the people who follow. I'm not a filmmaker. But in comparison to the original, the trendsetters in terms of those genres, that's the difference, I think, between the really great artists and the mid-tier artists. They think they're doing the Babadook, right? They think they're following that, but they're doing a version of it that lacks the soul, lacks the depth, and turns, as you described, those subtext into text. And they think they've just done the same thing, but they haven't. They've done a very surface level iteration of it, but they're missing what made the original so great. And I think that's when you find those artists who do something really creative. That's, I feel like, the difference is, and people, the novice will say, oh, I could do that. I could write a story like that. Well, now that you've seen it written, you could write a story like that, and it still wouldn't actually be as good or as deep because you think you're doing it, right?
That's it.
So that's just one of those things about the great artists, is their ability to pull that kind of thing off originally.
Another parallel I could draw between this and the Babadook is that the filmmaker who made the Babadook, Jennifer Kent, her follow-up to that, she didn't make a straight-up horror film. She actually made a revenge film called The Nightingale, which is searing. Basically an Irish indentured servant in, I want to say, Tasmania in the 1800s. And she is living, basically, she's an indentured servant to this one officer, and he refuses to let her go. And when she tries to, she has technically served her time, she's done her service, but he won't sign off and free her. And savage things happen. I'm not even going to describe it, but it's an exceptional film. And Mark Jenkin, his film prior to this, was not a horror film. Bait is a drama, from what I understand. I wasn't able to see it because it's not available to me in Canada, but it's not a horror film. And when he first started writing Enys Men, it wasn't quite a horror film either. And so I think that's, sometimes you get folks who just say, well, I'm only going to make horror films. But if they can accomplish multiple things, I think that sort of points to that greater artistic skill. I mean, even the filmmaker Adam Green, who's done the Hatchet films. I mean, sure, people will say, oh, Hatchet, they're just slasher films. But even those, if you listen to Green's commentaries, there is depth happening there. And he's also done thrillers. He's also done, he did a sitcom for 2 seasons. So he's able to kind of hop genres while still being able to come back to horror and make something effective. And so I'm really curious to see if what Jenkin does after this, whether his next film is horror or whether he goes in another direction entirely.
Well, it sounds like to me what you're describing is someone who is determined to make a good film with a good story and isn't trying to necessarily fit a genre. They will make the film and it will fit into a genre based on the story. Whereas, the filmmakers who will remain unnamed are literally just trying to create a formula for a specific genre of film, and they are trying to make certain genre films. And that, obviously, we've talked more than we need to about how badly that failed. But this filmmaker and some of the other filmmakers you're talking about, they're putting the story first, the film first, and making the film they have a vision for, and not trying to fit it into a genre. It just then ends up fitting into a genre sometimes, and sometimes it transcends a genre. But it's not worrying about trying to be a horror film. It's worrying about being a great film, and then it ends up becoming whatever it becomes.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that Enys Men, up until the point where the volunteer is woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of children singing outside, up to that point, it's not a horror film. It's just a very quiet drama about a woman living alone on this island off the coast of Cornwall. And then that is sort of the point where it becomes that, then it is a horror film, because again, she wakes up in the night, she hears children singing, she goes down, and things start to fracture. That really is kind of where she breaks. And but yeah, up until that point, it works as just a drama. And honestly, if you took away the horror elements, you still have a compelling character study of a woman who has loved and lost. And, you discover that she's become attached to the fisherman who brings the supplies. They were, periodic lovers, and they had an affair of sorts, clearly between two people who are not very connected to their feelings, but there is, mutual care there. And she has loved and lost this person. So again, even if you take away the horror elements, the film just works on a character level, which is really impressive when you consider how little dialogue there is.
I mean, that's part of what I thought was so masterful about this film and this filmmaker, is that they created a narrative with very little dialogue. And even the dialogue, the limited dialogue, is not deep at all. It's like the story is deep and the narrative's deep, but the dialogue is very basic, right? And that is part of what makes this so brilliant in terms of the ability to create that narrative, and not, so many filmmakers lean heavily on the dialogue to create the characters and to establish and put forward the narrative. And this filmmaker didn't, need anything in terms of profound lines to be delivered. It was like, who's out there? I thought you weren't supposed to pick the flowers. I mean, very basic lines, and it almost doesn't matter what they said, because that's not what the character or the story were driven by.
That's it. And I think a huge portion of this, a huge portion of the credit is due to the performances. Mary Woodvine plays the volunteer, and she just owns the screen the whole time she's there. Apparently she does a lot of theater in Cornwall, and it shows, because she's she can just command the screen without doing a whole bunch. And again, when she and the fisherman, played by, I think, Edward Rowe, are together in the living room, again, both of them have this way of showing that these are two people who are maybe a little too closed off for their own good, but there is still mutual consideration there, and mutual affection, but it's never spoken. And as you say, a lazier filmmaker would have to say something. He would have to say, oh, I wish you would talk to me more, or whatever. And the most you get out of this is the volunteer says to the fisherman, you should stay. And he says, no, I can't. And the brilliance of that is it works whether you're talking about the situation of just someone who has a job and has to keep doing the job, which in a lot of ways is the nature of working class people. I wish you could stay home. I wish I could too, but I have to go do what I have to go do. And in order to keep us alive, that's what I have to do. And whether it's going into the mines or going out to sea or going, I grew up in a mill town. You go work at the sawmill 12 hours a day, come home puking up cedar dust. So it works on that level, but it also works because by this point in the narrative, we discover he is dead. He is an hallucination. And so this is sort of works on two different levels. And again, it's effortless. Something else I wanted to touch on was something that, again, I quasi-noticed the first time, but after reading about Jenkins' process, I just really watched for it the second time and kind of fell in love with it, is the sound design. He doesn't record any sound on set. Everything is added in post. So he builds his own soundscapes. So everything that you're seeing on screen is an effect added later. And when you start to watch it and you start to listen for the layers, he makes his own sound effects as well. He does his own Foley. Me being an audio nerd and doing the audio dramas, transmissions from the void for Ghost Story guys, I have some passing experience with this. Obviously, I'm not doing Dolby mixes, but, I've made soundscapes, and he does it so well that you don't notice it's happening. If he hadn't told me that that's how he did it, it never would have occurred to me that that's what was going on. Even the dialogue is recorded in post.
That is interesting. Yeah. It's all subtle, right? The sounds of the marching and with the maids and the rocks she drops into the mine shaft and the limited dialogue and the generator and things like that.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Okay. Interesting. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things I enjoyed, which were more kind of the themes and things from the film. Little bits I noticed, and also how I think it compared to some of the other films we've talked about. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is this as a film that was a descent into madness, at least is how I interpreted that. And, at one level, we watched another film, that we've done a podcast about, The Outwaters, which was also a sort of this venture into madness in a very different sort of a way. And, I thought this was a much more understated and moving kind of approach towards that. But there were some interesting things with it, like the way that they established this sense of routine. Every day she went and she took the temperature measurements of the flowers and noted any changes. And most days there were no changes. And then she'd go back and she would drop a rock in a very deliberate way into the mine shaft. And then she would go by that sort of monolith statue monument thing. And something about that sense of routine, I think, one kind of speaks to the isolation of a person who has nothing else to do, no one to interact with. So they create these routines to keep themselves sane. And from that, you were able to see when the breaks in her routine, I thought, were sort of representative of the breakdown of her sanity in a sense. There was the point where one of these days things were very different and she seemed in a hurry and she sort of haphazardly tossed a stone into the well. But then OCD kind of kicks in and she comes back and she kind of has to drop it in the same way, right? And then you see later in the film, looking down that mine shaft, she sees, one of the miners. So where she's fully sort of descended into this. I thought it was kind of funny that, when she ran out of tea, you knew that shit was about to get real, right? Because this is a Brit, right?
This is England.
Yeah. But the sense of routine in a sort of a weird way kind of gave you this baseline against which you could see how when the routine broke, that was when things were kind of going sideways for her.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because there was a moment later that I found really poignant, because I've definitely had this experience when she has the hallucination and sort of it breaks through that, the Gavenik, the boat which would bring her supplies with her sort of lover, it sank and he died, and that she just loses her shit. I mean, obviously this is a memory. She knows this has already happened, but you see her, she throws multiple rocks down the mine shaft. And that, to me, that was such a heartbreaking moment, because it's almost like you're trying to make things normal. you're thinking if I can just do the normal things will be normal again. Maybe if I just throw enough rocks down there, if I try and till that ground over and over again, maybe I can make things okay. I can make things the way they were. And I think we've all been through that in some way or another, where you try to retrace the steps where things went wrong and you think, fuck. Well, okay, if I keep trying, it's almost like a kid just wishing they could make it right. And yeah, I found that really, really poignant. And to a certain degree, I understand on another level because, as someone who's neurodivergent, undiagnosed, but I'm fucking weird enough, it seems very likely, I'm very much both a person who requires routine and who rejects it at every turn. And so it's this fascinating thing where, again, I understand how bad things can go when you don't throw the rock down the well at exactly the right time.
So speaking of the rock thing, and I'm not sure, I want to maybe, since you're kind of talking about the routine and the rocks and that connection, there's a point towards the very end where she picks up the very big rock and she's looking down and you see the miner down there just staring up at her, and she holds onto it while, and then she puts it down and she doesn't drop it down the mine shaft. I wasn't sure what I thought the significance of that was, but it seems like there's certainly something, like, certainly she was choosing not to drop it on the miner, potentially, and he's just standing there. Is this, I don't know, what do you make of that?
That's a good question. I was wondering that when I watched it. I mean, I almost think that's shocking her out of this loop she'd been in. Sometimes when I was younger and when I was really in bad emotional places, I would find that I would repeat the same sentence over and over and over. If I was having an argument with someone, I would just repeat the same sentence over and over and over. And it would take something to kind of shock me out of that loop for me to kind of think, okay, now I'll try and deal with this problem. But I would just, in stress, I would repeat it. And I kind of took that as whatever was going on, like that shocked her out of this moment she was having, because she was in this moment of terrible grief and terrible loss. And I almost wonder if seeing the miner was meant to be, you are not alone in your suffering. We are all people, like we have all lost. We are all the ghosts of the past. And something that Jenkin has talked about in interviews is one of the things he kind of wanted to emphasize was this idea of we are all so small in the face of time. The miners and the ball maidens who were the sort of the women in the outfits at the end. The men would mine the coal, and then the ball maidens would dress the coal on the surface. And this is sort of one of those parts of mining that apparently is not often talked about. Mining's always talked about as a male pursuit, but in actual fact, women were just as much a part of it. But we're all such an integral part, and in the moment we're also kind of occupied with our doing and our machinations. We forget how insignificant we are in the grand scheme of things. And I wonder if seeing the miner down there was her being shocked into, like, okay, yeah, my grief is bad, things are bad, but also I am not the only one who is hurt. I am not the only one who has suffered. So kind of not check your privilege. I was going to say check your privilege. That's not right. But just, calm down and deal with it.
So there was, and that's interesting. I had a little bit different kind of theme with that. And I don't have this fully formulated idea of exactly what I thought it was. But as I watched it, she was standing there with this large rock that obviously would be very dangerous if it was dropped on someone.
Sure.
And although the miner was a ghost, a hallucination, a vision, who knows what, it felt like she was in this place where she was going to drop this, and she was considering whether to drop it on him, and he's just standing there staring up. So it's this moment of she has this decision whether to act aggressively and violently or not. And then she chooses not to. Now, I don't know what the significance of that is, and maybe it's just another layer of what you're talking about that's pulling her out of it. Was part of coming out of it is, wait, no, I'm not a person who's going to drop a rock on someone's head, and then that's what pulls her out of it. I don't know. It's interesting. I'd love to know if the filmmaker had a specific idea for that, or if that was just one of those things that was meant to be interpreted. One other thing, there's some interesting little notes. Did you catch the name of the book she was reading and what the kind of the what was said on the front of the book?
Yeah, the book was a blueprint for survival.
Yeah, and then there was a quote on the front, a very big quote, like it was from a review or something. And did you catch that? What that said? It said, nightmarishly convincing. After reading it, nothing seems quite the same anymore. So it was interesting because the title and that quote just thematically tie in, right? Surviving perhaps grief or surviving whatever it was. And how that quote, that description of it, nightmarishly convincing. After reading it, nothing seems quite the same anymore. Just almost seems like a description of her experience. So just one of those little details that is just kind of in there that most people might not even take the time to kind of really look at. But again, some of that interesting little subtext there.
Yeah, and fascinatingly enough, I was reading about that, and Jenkins said that was more or less an accident. The book was not intended to be. It was sort of he was looking for books written in 1973. And came across that one and chose that one. And he later sort of realized, oh, okay, yeah, I can actually understand, I can sort of, this fits into the overall theme, but apparently was not originally part of the plan. It's like, I don't know if you noticed some of the shots of the water running backwards.
Mm-hmm. I did, yeah.
Yeah, and he said that was legitimately because he didn't have enough footage. And so he just, because basically they shot all the stuff with the cast over the course of about 3 weeks in the spring. And then over the course of the summer, he took his camera and went around shooting B-roll. But he said because he shoots film, he can't afford to just shoot willy-nilly like he can with digital. So he had to be selective. And what that led to was in the edit, shit, I don't have enough footage. So he reused some shots of the water, but ran it backwards. And then he realized, okay, now I have to make this make thematic sense. And it was kind of one of those happy accidents. And I think the book was a little bit like that too. Although something that occurred to me with that was the way she's living on that island is really the way, I mean, without the generator, of course, but that's the way people, the original inhabitants, would have lived as well. And, if the world ever kind of collapses under its own weight, society ever collapses under its own weight, the way some people think it will, it is also the way we would have to live then. So, that is, in a lot of ways, it is a blueprint for survival. The way this little life she has carved out for herself. And again, it's just a fascinating little parallel. And it sort of made me wonder, I sometimes, I don't know if this goes anywhere, Joseph, I just want to talk about it. But the film made me think about something. I don't know if you've ever seen the Friday the 13th films.
I have, actually, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I think it's 6. I think it's part 6. Horror nerds, if I'm wrong, let us know. WeirdTogetherPod or WeirdTogetherShow@gmail.com. But basically, the character of Tommy Wallace in part 4 is a little boy. No, it's not Tommy Wallace. Tommy Jarvis, I think. Yeah, I think it's Tommy Jarvis. But anyways, yeah, Tommy Wallace is Halloween. But anyways, so he's a little kid in part 4, kills Jason, and then in part 6, he's a grown man. Now, there's only a few years between the films, but obviously the timeline is meant to be about 20 years. And it kind of fascinated me because I think to me it unintentionally posits this future, which is basically going to be about the year 2000, although the film never says that, where they're essentially just living in like the 80s, but 20 years later. And I always thought about that. I always wondered, what would the world be like if we didn't have the digital revolution, if we didn't have sort of this tech race where everything became, hyper connected, hyper fast, and we just kind of kept living in that moment. And part of me sort of yearns for that in a way, for the world of my childhood, but extended through to adulthood. Because I grew up, you and I both grew up pre-internet, pre-digital. And so we are part of that generation that has a foot in both worlds. And Enys Men kind of made me think about that for the 70s. That what if we had maintained that world where, because the world of her world is not that different from the world of the miners. And again, I just wondered what, this film seemed to me to be like the extension of that. What is the world like if we just live the 70s, but 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, how different would that have been? again, I don't really have a point. It fills me with a sort of wistfulness that I can't quite explain. I don't know. I don't necessarily what to say to that, but I wanted to tell someone. I've had this thought in my head for years, and you're a doctor, right? I unloaded on you.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because they call the generations that are born into this new technological era digital natives, right? They're born into it, and we are not. We acclimated to it, and I think it'll be interesting down the road to kind of look back and see what like kind of Gen X and thereabouts, how that impacts our experiences, and I feel like it's an advantage to know both worlds in terms of a lot of different things, like, things like ability to write and research. And, we were doing a panel discussion at the university where I'm at years ago, and they talked about kind of the younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs. And one of the things that came up is like, a lot of like people in the younger generations, I sound like an old man saying that, but you research is you Google and you look up the first couple things that you read the first few things that come up, right? It's a much more cursory sort of exploration. And we're from a generation that at some point had to go and dig a little deeper, right? Sure. And knows how to dig a little deeper. So now when we are faced with, when we have these tools, I feel like we probably know how to discern them a little better, I would think, from that experience. So there's some interesting things. But at the same time, I found myself thinking, as much as I enjoy non-digital things, hanging out with people, good conversations, and things like that in relationships, there was part of me that was like, oh man, I'd be so bored. It's like, so as much as I espouse the virtues of my generation, having the ability to deal with life without pre-internet, or at least internet being ubiquitous, I also have sort of been pulled into and acclimated to being used to being entertained. And when Wi-Fi goes down, for some technical reason here at home, I also am just like, cursing at the universe for, man, when's the internet going to be back up? So yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword there, I guess.
Just to put a button on that, I had this experience the other morning. I'm trying to, when I go to bed, I try to charge my phone on the other side of the room, because one of my bad habits in the morning, because I'm very much not a morning person. So one of my bad habits in the morning is if I plug it in within arm's reach of where I'm at, I will kind of look at it instead of getting out of bed. Instead of getting up to make breakfast and go to the gym or whatever, I'll look at my phone for an hour sometimes. And so I all right, try and put it somewhere where it's not within easy reach. But the other morning, I had it plugged in on the other side of the room, but there was a beautiful sunny morning. I didn't want to get out of bed just yet. And I had my book next to me that I'm reading. I happened to pick up a paperback copy of James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain when I was wandering around used bookshops a little while ago. And so I just had this weird experience, which I realized is something that people did for a hell of a lot longer than they've been looking at their phones, which is, I don't want to get out of bed yet. I'll just read my book. What a crazy concept. Words on the printed page. Where do I plug it in? It was, I don't know.
Yeah, I saw something somewhere, research about how when you first get up, if you, first thing you do is go to a screen, and like a computer screen or phone screen, there's something about that is disruptive in kind of the cognitive processes or whatever it is that is involved in waking up and feeling refreshed. And I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak very profoundly or accurately on that, but there's something to that where, and based on that, I also try to make sure that I don't immediately grab my screen, right? I try to do a few other things, and by a few other things, it might only just be a couple of minutes, but I try to not have the first thing my eyes see when I'm waking up be my phone screen.
What a concept. Yeah, I got to work a little harder on that, because I've kind of come back around to, it's just plugged in next to my bed. What could go wrong? Can't imagine why I feel so shitty in the morning, Joseph. It's all very, very, very much a mystery. I guess we're coming in for a landing here. Do you have any final thoughts on Enys Men?
Just that it was a very well done film. I mean, of the films we've done, just in terms of the artistry, this is on a very short list of the best films for me. It's up there with, to me, Saloon and A Wounded Fawn as some of the best we've looked at. It's very no wasted motion in terms of the artistry and such. There may be some things those other films do better, but something about this was very cohesive and just very well put together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a fully formed artistic vision. And I was thinking about it. You and I have generally agreed that Saloon is the best movie we've done. And I would put Enys Men up there with Saloon. Because I think it's on that short list. Yeah, because you're right. I mean, it in a lot of ways, they're similar in that they both depict very distinct cultures in very unique geographical regions that I think are not otherwise served on film. I mean, Christ, I was married in Cornwall, Joseph. I was married in the city of Penzance in Cornwall, and I knew none of this stuff. Where Jenkin lives, Newlyn, I went there with Nick prior to our wedding. And again, there's all the artistic community there. There's all this history there. Standing stones. We didn't even get a chance to talk about the standing stones. That's all in Cornwall, and I had no idea, just as I knew fuck all about the Saloon Delta. So, no, I couldn't agree more. These things are definitely on our short list. If you haven't seen Enys Men yet and you want to check it out, it's rentable on VOD platforms everywhere. I think it's about $5. It is very much worth your time. Again, support independent film, folks. Every dollar you spend on independent film is a vote for more independent films. Do not pirate independent films. We're not generally fans of piracy anyways, but if you're going to do it for the big boys. Do it to Marvel, do it to Disney. Those guys can afford it. But every dollar you spend on independent film encourages people to continue to make more of them. Every dollar you don't spend on it is a black mark against them because distributors won't make this shit if they don't think it's going to make money. You can say, well, that's crass, that's commercial. That's showbiz, baby. So pay your fucking money. Go see the movie. We cannot recommend it enough. And I think that's it. Joseph, where can everyone find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at JOKOMO13, Jokomo13, and you can find me on YouTube at The Cardinal Rule if you're into NFL football.
Fabulous. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky as Largely the Truth. You can find my podcast, The Ghost Story Guys, everywhere fine podcasts live, and on YouTube. And if you want to get in touch with us, as we said earlier, you can email us at weirdtogethershow@gmail.com. That's weirdtogethershow@gmail.com. If you have a theory on Enys Men, or you just want to talk about the films we've seen or comment on the show, again, weirdtogethershow@gmail.com. All music on this podcast is composed and performed by The Revenants. The Revenants are a project of the Boston-based musician Elliot Wilder. Our theme song is Rest in Peace from the album Music from Big Beige. You can find The Revenants on streaming platforms everywhere, courtesy of Night Harvest Recordings. That's the Ghost Story Guys house label. And if you want to buy the albums directly, you can get them at therevenants1.bandcamp.com. And if you're going to buy The Revenants music, that is a place to do it. You can get it on iTunes, all that shit. But if you buy them direct from Elliot, you also get really detailed liner notes and art. He is an incredibly meticulous artist. You don't get any of that crap with iTunes, unfortunately. It's just how it works. So if you want the full meal deal, get it from Elliot at therevenants1.bandcamp.com. Folks, thanks so much for joining us. We've been doing this now for a little over a year. It's so much fun just to get to hang out with my friend and talk movies and find new movies to bring to you guys. And, our numbers keep going up every new episode, and we just are so heartened by that. We were charting, I think, in 3 countries now. I think one of them was like Ghana or so, who knows, somewhere unexpected. But we're just thrilled that you guys are enjoying the show. Tell your friends, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes if you can, and join us for our monthly live streams. The next one this month, Joseph, when is it? May 31st? Yes, on May 31st. That'll be at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 7 o'clock Pacific. And we will be, I believe, talking about the new film from director Spider-1, Bury the Bride. So
I'm looking forward to that. We enjoyed Allegoria.
Yes, and he seems like a cool guy. So, and I've seen the film already. I really liked it, so I'm hoping you enjoy it too. But You'll have to tune into the live stream to see. All right, folks. Until next time, remember, we're weird.
And you're weird.
So why not be weird together? See you next time.